All right, welcome to the next video in the series. This is going to be a short one. We want to cover a couple of quick concepts that are important to understand when working with helper classes for the first time. The first one I want to talk about is what is a two-string method? Why is it important to define it? It's common if you make a helper class, in this case I've made a class called dog, and maybe I did a good job, I've set up my setters and my getters so I can access the variable fields of those objects, and you think to yourself, okay, I'm ready to go ahead and print out my object. Well, you might go to print that object, and what happens? You get this nonsense right here. And you might think to yourself, hey, that looks actually kind of familiar from our arrays unit, and you wouldn't be wrong. So what's going on here is we're given the name of the class, and I believe these characters here have something to do with where this is stored in memory. It's at 7960847B. It's something to do with the identity of the object itself, I think in memory. Well, that's often not what we want. If I want to print out the dog object, I actually want to see some information about the dog. And it's up for me to decide what that is. Do I want to print out all of the variables? Is there just one I want to print out? And to me, I'm going to say when I print out my dog object, I just want to see the dog's name. So what you can do is you can head down to your, you've got our state up here, which is the variables. You've got the behavior, which is the methods. I'm going to go ahead and add a new method right here called a two-string method. And it's public. The method signature is always the exact same. Public string two-string, no parameter. And then you just pick, all right, when I go to print one of these objects, what do I want to have print out? Return name, great. And so what you can do is I can say, all right, I'm going to print this object. Let me go ahead and call the two-string method. So you go to call it, and now my object, D1, for whom I set the name variable to Boomer, now when I go to print it out, it says Boomer. Maybe I decide, you know what, I want to see the name and the age. Maybe, I'm setting up my doggy daycare. Let's see both of those pieces of information. And you run it, and now when you go to print the object, it says, oh, Boomer 0. That's funny because I haven't actually set the age. Let's do that. Poor Boomer. He's not a puppy anymore. He's 2 now. Set age 2. Run it. There it is. Boomer 2. A cool thing about the two-string method is that there's a shortcut that Java offers, which is if you just try to print an object, Java will implicitly call that two-string method for you. So if I go to run this, boom, we're going to get the same output. And the reason that worked was because when we printed the object, Java knows to go and look, okay, D1, what's its class? Dog? Let's go see if dogs have a two-string method defined. Oh, here it is. There's the two-string method. Okay, when I print this thing out, go get its name, go get its age, something like that. So it is often useful, we talk about all of our responsibilities when we set up a helper class. For all of our variables, for all of our fields, we should set up a setter and a getter. And it's also a good idea to set up a two-string method so that it's easy to print these objects and get to the information that's inside of them. Now, something that you have probably noticed at this point is that all of my methods down here, whether it's two-string or is geriatric or any of my setters or getters, they're all missing a word that we've traditionally had in all of our methods. And that word is static. And the reason for this is, I'm going to say a helpful mnemonic is that when we're working with the client, our methods are static. And when we're working with the helper, our methods, so when we're working with the helper, our methods are instance. What does that mean? What was the purpose of the static keyword? The way that I would define static is static often means belongs to the class. And I would say that instance means belongs to the object. So because every dog I make needs to be individual, it needs to be different from all the other dogs. If I have, the D1 dog is Boomer and the D2 dog is McCoy, I don't want them to be mixing up their ages or whether they're vaccinated. D1 gets its own variables, D2 gets its own variables. When I ask D1 to perform a method, only the D1 object needs to perform that method. If I ask the D2 dog to perform a method, only it needs to perform that method. It is possible to use static methods or even static variables in a helper class. But what you need to understand is that if it's static, that means that it will affect every object that's been created so far. So a way to think about this is maybe I would say, let's go with static Boolean kennel closed, something like that. And you know what's funny is that's actually probably a variable that's better as a global variable in kennel or somewhere else, but I'm going to put it right here. So let's say the kennel closes on the weekends, right? It's on Saturday and Sunday, things aren't open. And so I don't want to have to, if I have 10 dogs, I don't want to go through to dog 1 and dog 2 and dog 3 and manually set all of their kennel closed variables to true. I'd rather just be able to have one variable that's seen by all dog objects. And by making my dog field static, that's what I do. Every dog gets their own name. D1 has a name and D2 has a name, and those names are different. But because this variable right here is static, that means that there is just one variable that all of the dogs point to. So if I ask D1 what its kennel closed is, it's going to be the same as the D2's kennel closed and the D3's kennel closed. For that reason, if I have a static variable, I'm going to access it in a static way. So I'm going to say dog.kennelClosed equals false. So you'll notice this looks way different than the way we've been working with helper classes before. Before I said, look, you can't use any part of your helper class until you've made the object, and then you can start calling its methods and referring to its variables. Well, because the kennel closed variable doesn't belong to any one object, it belongs to all the members of that class, then we would call it from the class and not from the object. So if you have a variable that you want to have be the same for all members of your object, you can make it static. Just remember to refer to it in a static way. So we would say that, let's see if I can do this. D1.age equals 3. Is that going to work? Yeah. So D1.age equals 3. This is an instance variable reference. And dog.kennelClosed equals false. That's a static variable reference. So something, you've probably watched this video so far and you're thinking to yourself, well, this doesn't actually explain why the main method was using static this whole time. And the reason is this is part of the required vocabulary for the main method in Java. It had to be public, static, no return type of void. The name had to be main. It had to be an array of strings that was identified as args. This was one of the requirements. I think what's easier to understand is that if I make any other methods in the client class, like let's say public static void print greeting. We might say, welcome to doggy daycare, something like that. Then you'll notice that I had to make this method was static, but all the other methods in my helper class were not static. They don't have the static keyword, they're instance. So because this method, the print greeting method, was going to get called by a static method, it needed to be static. So you'll notice if I try to say print greeting right here, and I'm going to go ahead and delete out this print statement, I can run it and it says, welcome to doggy daycare. If I try and take the static out right here, I'm going to get an error, which says, cannot make a static reference to the non-static method print greeting in the type kennel. So why are all of the methods in kennel going to be static? because the main method is required to be static, and once it's static, all of the methods it references should be static. That's one of those things that you're probably just going to have to do, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty appreciating of why, but something that we should understand why is it ever useful to have a static method in your helper class? Well, if I have a static variable like kennel closed, if I tried to make it a setter, public void set kennel closed to, we need a Boolean, I'm just going to call it kennel closed. This dot kennel closed equals kennel closed. Oops, not kennel closed. Kennel closed. There we go. You'll notice right here it lets us do it, but it gives us a warning that says, you should change the access to dog instead of doing it from this object, because it should be happening at the class level, not at the object level. So this should say dog.kennelClosed. So it is possible to make a method static. This one didn't need to be static, but it is possible to make a method static in the helper class. It doesn't happen super often, but the thing to understand is that if you make a static method in a helper class, when you call it, all of the objects of that class will perform that action. So just be aware that unless that's what you want, you should be using an instance method. So what did we talk about in this video? We talked about how you should add a toString method to make your objects easier to print, and that because helper methods, helper classes, are going to be individual objects, they generally don't want static variables and don't want static methods, because they are going to be handling things as individual objects, not from the level of the broader class. Okay, thanks for watching.